Robert Berdella Jr. was an American serial killer who kidnapped, raped, tortured, and murdered at least 6 young men, forcing his victims to endure periods of up to 6 weeks in captivity. His crimes took place in Kansas City, Missouri between 1984 and 1987, describing his murders as being He pleaded guilty and was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for the first-degree murder of Larry Pearson in August 1988. He would later plead guilty to one further charge of first-degree murder and 4 charges of second-degree murder in December 1988. He died of a heart attack whilst incarcerated at the Missouri State Penitentiary in October 1992. He became known as the Kansas City Butcher due to his practice of extensively dissecting his victims' bodies, which he would then dispose of in garbage bags, and the name The Collector was due to the movie which he had stated was the basis of the fantasies behind the modus operandi of his crimes. Robert Andrew Berdella Jr. was born on the 31st of January 1949 in Cuyahoga Falls, Ohio, the first of 2 sons born to Robert Andrew Berdella Sr., a die setter for the Ford Motor Company, and Mary Louise Berdella. His father was a devout Roman Catholic of Italian descent, while his mother was of German and British descent. The family regularly attended Mass, and both sons regularly attended religious education courses. As a child, he was intelligent but a loner who rarely played outside of his home and rarely had friends visit to socialise. He had a speech impediment and wore thick glasses from the age of 5 because he was severely nearsighted. He was also diagnosed with blood pressure, for which he took several medications. He was largely unathletic, whereas his younger brother Daniel displayed an aptitude for sports from an early age. Berdella's father valued sports and physical education and viewed his older son's lack of interest in sports as a sign of failure, after comparing him unfavourably with his younger brother. Occasionally his father physically and emotionally abused his children, such as beating them with a leather strap. He performed well academically, though teachers often found him difficult to teach, partly due to his aloofness and being the recipient of bullying by other students. Because of this, he rarely socialised with his peers. When he reached puberty, he discovered that he was gay. Initially, he kept this fact a closely guarded secret and didn't become open about sexuality for several years. Nonetheless, in his early teens, he briefly had a girlfriend. By his mid-teens, he'd begun to display a degree of aggression, becoming rude and condescending to others, particularly women. He learned about cooking and art and developed showmanship. On Christmas Day 1965, the family drove to Canton, Ohio to visit relatives. That evening, his father had a heart attack at the age of 39. 2 days later, he returned to Cuyahoga Falls by himself. When he arrived home, his family told him that his father had passed away. He sought solace in his Catholicism, reading extensively about many faiths. He eventually became cynical about all religion. In 1965, he saw the film adaptation of the John Fowles novel The Collector. A description of the film is as follows. Clerk Freddie Clegg, Terence Stamp, an avid butterfly collector, wins a football pool and buys a country house with a large basement. He then kidnaps art student Miranda Gray, Samantha Edgar, a longtime crush of his. After trailing her in a van, Freddie locks Miranda in the basement and buys her clothes and books so that she can get to know him. They initially agree that she will stay at the house for a month, but Miranda fears what will happen when the time comes for her to leave. Berdella stated that this movie had formed a lasting impression on him. Shortly after the death of his father, his mother remarried, which Berdella resented, viewing it as a form of betrayal against his late father. As a result, he became increasingly withdrawn and further immersed himself in the activities he had participated in since childhood, such as painting, collecting coins and stamps, and writing to foreign pen pals. He would later claim that his hobby of writing to pen pals in countries such as Vietnam and Burma, and them sending him stamps and photographs of mythical and historical icons, ancient cultures, and architecture, would lead to his avid interest in primitive art, photographs, and antiques. From approximately 1965, he began collecting such artifacts. This practice would inspire him to open his own antiques business in 1982. In the summer of 1967, he graduated from the Cuyahoga Falls High School. Throughout his studies in high school, he had earned such excellent grades and showed such potential that in 1966, one teacher had placed him in an independent study program. Shortly after his graduation, he relocated to Kansas City, enrolling in the Kansas City Art Institute with aspirations of becoming a college professor. In his first year at the KCAI, he was considered an attentive and talented student, although in his second year he became vocally anti-authoritarian, becoming acquainted with a clique of students who supplied him with drugs, which he then sold to other students at a profit. He then began regularly abusing alcohol. He also engaged in acts of animal torture on at least 2 occasions. During one of these instances, he decapitated a duck in the presence of his peers, and in the second he experimented with sedatives and tranquilizers on a dog. At the age of 19, he was arrested for attempting to sell methamphetamine to an undercover officer. However, he was released after posing a $3,000 bond, equivalent to about $27,100 as of 2025. He would later plead guilty and was handed a 5-year suspended sentence. However, only 1 month after his first arrest, along with 2 other students, they were arrested for possession of marijuana and LSD in Johnson County. On this occasion, Berdella couldn't post bond, and he spent 5 days in jail as a result. The charges against him and one other student would be dropped due to a lack of evidence. In 1969, Berdella voluntarily withdrew from KCAI after receiving harsh criticism from college administrators for killing and cooking a duck for the sake of art. He chose to remain in Kansas City, and in September of that year, he moved into an address within the Hyde Park district, 4315 Charlotte Street. By this stage, he had been openly gay for several years. He began spending much of his time with male prostitutes, drug addicts, petty criminals, and runaways. He would typically befriend these individuals, then try to help free them from their drug addictions or criminal lifestyles, though he was adamant that, throughout much of the 1970s, he had no physical contact whatsoever with any of them. To several of his neighbours, he stated that he felt almost like a foster parent to many of the youths. By the early 1980s, many of his older acquaintances had stopped having any form of social contact with him. He increasingly relied on the young men as a source of companionship and friendship. He would later claim to have become increasingly frustrated that many of these individuals were ignorant of his efforts to help steer them away from self-destructive behaviour. Despite these later claims, he would often engage in sexual relationships with the men he befriended and would establish a degree of control over them, in part to engage in the sexual relations by loaning them money and allowing them to live rent-free at his house for periods of time. To his neighbours, he was considered flamboyant yet helpful and civic-minded, despite the generally unkept state of his property and his somewhat haughty attitude. In the beginning of the 1970s, he worked with the South Hyde Park Crime Prevention and Neighbourhood Association, becoming the chairman in the early 1980s and encouraging neighbourhood watch patrols. He remained active in the association until the mid-1980s, where he left his position. He also volunteered at fundraising events for a local public television station until the mid-1980s. Shortly before he moved into his Charlotte Street address, he began working as a short-order cook in various restaurants around Kansas City, in part to help pay lawyer fees and fines accrued from his previous drug arrest. For additional income, he also sold art and antiques he had collected from contacts he had established in Africa, Asia, South America, and various Pacific Rim countries. He initially operated this side business from home. Both his cooking career and the antiques business flourished. By the mid-1970s, he began working as a senior cook at several renowned Kansas City restaurants. He joined a chefs association and helped establish a training program for aspiring chefs at a local community college. At the same time, he devoted more attention to his own business. By 1981, he had established several contractual agreements with both national and international contacts for his antiques business. He viewed this as his full-time job and later quit working as a chef. In 1982, Berdella began renting his own booth at the Westport Flea Market. The store was named Bob's Bazaar and primarily sold and traded primitive art, jewellery and antiques. Although occasionally making a generous monthly profit, the income from his business was insufficient to maintain his expenses and make ends meet. As a result, he would occasionally steal or scavenge items to sell at his booth. He would also take lodgers at his home as a means of gaining additional income. At the flea market, he became acquainted with a fellow merchant named Paul Howell, who operated a booth adjacent to his own. Soon, Berdella became acquainted with Paul Howell's younger son, Jerry. Initially, Jerry Howell and his friends taunted Berdella for his overt homosexuality, although according to Berdella, Jerry Howell later confided to him that he and his friends occasionally earned money as male prostitutes. By the early 1980s, Paul Howell had relocated his business to a store close to the intersection of 39th and Main Street, with his family living in an apartment above the shop. Berdella remained a casual friend of the family, offering his assistance if Jerry encountered any minor scrapes with the law. Berdella is believed to have killed his first victim on the 5th of July 1984, 19-year-old Jerry Howell. Berdella had promised to drive Howell to attend a dancing contest in Merriam. According to Berdella, he plied Howell with alcohol diazepam and acetylmazarine, both in his car and at his house, until he became unconscious. He then injected Howell with a heavy tranquilizer before binding him to his bed. Howell was restrained to Berdella's bed for approximately 28 hours. Throughout his period of captivity, Berdella repeatedly drugged, tortured, raped, and violated him with foreign objects, repeatedly ignoring Howell asking why he was being treated this way and is pleased to be freed. According to Berdella Jr., Berdella will later state that he briefly attempted to perform cardiopulmonary resuscitation upon Howell after he died, then dragged his body to the basement. He suspended the body above a large cooking pot and made several incisions to his inner elbows and the jugular vein, leaving the body suspended in the position overnight to allow the blood to drain from his body. The following day, he dismembered Howell's body using a chainsaw and boning knives and wrapped the sections in newspaper and trash bags. These bags were later placed inside larger trash bags, which Berdella placed outside for a garbage crew to collect and take away to a landfill site. When later questioned by officers investigating Howell's disappearance, Berdella claimed to have driven him to Merriam as promised, where they then parted company close to Howell's intended destination. Berdella further claimed that he'd not seen him since. As would be the case with all of Berdella's murders, he kept a detailed log in which he documented each act of sexual and physical torture inflicted upon his victim. He would recall that, like his subsequent victims, Howell had repeatedly pleaded with him to stop the abuse of torture, although Berdella would either ignore the pleas, taunt him, or threaten him. He would remain adamant to investigators that he did not do this for his enjoyment, but for what he called his physical and mental satisfaction. On the 10th of April 1985, a former lodger, 20-year-old Robert Sheldon, arrived on Berdella's doorstep asking if he could stay at his house for a short time. According to Berdella, although Sheldon paid his rent responsibly, he considered him to be an inconvenience. Although he was not physically attracted to Sheldon, on the 12th of April, he drugged and held him captive because he returned home from work to find Sheldon intoxicated. Berdella was adamant that he held no firm malice towards Sheldon, but saw him as someone whom he could Sheldon was drugged with sedatives and held captive in the second-floor bedroom for 3 days, enduring forms of torture such as swabbing of drain cleaner in his left eye, the insertion of needles beneath his fingertips, the binding of his wrists with piano wire with the intention of permanently damaging the nerves in his hands, and filling his ears with caulking to reduce his hearing capacity. 3 days after Berdella had begun holding Sheldon captive, on the 15th of April, a workman came to perform scheduled work on the roof of his home, leading Berdella to fatally suffocate Sheldon by placing a sack over his head, which he then tightened with a piece of rope. He then dissected Sheldon's body on the third-floor bathroom. The following June, Berdella found Mark Wallace, a very casual acquaintance who had previously helped him with yard work, hiding in his tool shed to seek shelter from a severe thunderstorm. As had been the case with Robert Sheldon, Berdella invited him inside his house and, noting Wallace's acute state of tenseness and depression, volunteered to inject him with chlorpromazine with the explanation that it would calm down and relax him. Wallace willingly accepted the offer and, 30 minutes later, Berdella decided to render him captive. Wallace was carried to the second-floor bedroom where he endured almost a day of captivity, and torture included the application of alligator clips to his nipples to facilitate electrical shocks to the body at any point which Wallace began regressing into a state of unconsciousness. According to Berdella, 1 hour after his experimenting with hypodermic needles by inserting them into various muscles upon Wallace's back, Mark Wallace died through a combination of the drugs, the gag, and the lack of oxygen. He noted his time of death as being 7 p.m. on the 23rd of June. On the 22nd of September 1985, Berdella answered a phone call from an acquaintance named James Ferris, who asked to stay at his home for a short time. Berdella agreed with the intention of kidnapping him, whom he arranged to meet at a bar that evening. Despite the brutality to which he had subjected to his first 3 victims, Berdella claimed that Ferris was the first victim upon he intentionally inflicted torture. He also informed investigators that there were occasions during his final 3 victims' periods of captivity when he ceased making additions to his abuse logs because he assumed the victim would not be able to make it much longer. Berdella brought Ferris home and drugged him with crushed tranquilizers concealed in a meal, then tied him to his bed before torturing him for almost constantly for approximately 27 hours. The torture included the repeated administration of 7,700 volt electrical shocks to the shoulder and testicles for up to 5 minutes in each incident, and acupuncture via hypodermic needles to the neck and genitals. Ferris gradually became delirious, but Berdella continued his physical and sexual assaults until he noted in his log that Ferris was unable to sit up more than 10 to 15 seconds. The next entry read, and finally, Berdella noted that Ferris died with a slang term that he'd used in his career as a chef, 86, which Berdella later explained meant anything from throw it out to stop the project. Todd Stoops was a 23-year-old drug addict and occasional prostitute who, with his wife, had twice lived briefly at Berdella's house in 1984. After Stoops and his wife moved out of Berdella's home the second time, Berdella didn't see him again until a chance encounter at the Kansas City's Liberty Memorial Park on the 17th of June 1986. Berdella invited him to his house with an offer of lunch, with an added incentive of sex, as Stoops stated that he needed $13 to purchase drugs, the equivalent of about $37 as of 2025. Berdella would later stress to investigators that he'd been extremely physically attracted to Stoops, and he was held captive for 2 weeks before he died. He gradually increased Stoops' terror, attempting to make him cooperative and an incapacitated sex slave. Berdella used electrical shocks through Stoops' closed eyes in an attempt to blind him, and injected drain cleaner into his larynx to try to silence his screaming. During the second week of his capture, Stoops asked Berdella for a soft drink and a sandwich. When Berdella refused, Stoops burst into tears. On the 27th of June, he ruptured Stoops' anal wall with his fist, causing bleeding and discharge. Towards the end of Stoops' captivity, he tried to feed him ice cream and soup, although Stoops wasn't able to keep anything down. By the final day of his captivity, Stoops was so weak, Berdella later stated that he had been able to breathe in a sitting position. On the 1st of July 1986, Stoops died. A forensic pathologist later testified that the ruptured anal wall caused septic shock, which proved fatal. In the spring of 1987, Berdella became friendly with 20-year-old Larry Wayne Pearson. This casual friendship began when Pearson entered his shop and explained to Berdella that, as a child, he had held an interest in both witchcraft and wizardry. Shortly thereafter, Pearson temporarily lodged with Berdella and willingly performed chores around his home as a means of paying rent. According to Berdella, he didn't initially intend to capture Pearson, but began forming the plan to do so on the 23rd of June, 2 weeks after having bailed Pearson out of jail, and noting Pearson, in the weeks prior to his captivity, displayed little interest in finding a job. On the afternoon on the 23rd of June, Berdella and Pearson watched the movie Creepshow 2 before eating lunch. As they drove around Kansas, the young man began jokingly referring to his practice of robbing gay men in Wichita. This disclosure finalized Berdella's decision to hold Pearson captive. That evening, Berdella ensured Pearson became intoxicated before injecting him with chlorpyrrazepine and moving him down to his basement, where he bound Pearson's hands above his head, then linked the rope he had used for this purpose to a brick column before injecting Pearson's larynx with drain cleaner. He then brought an electrical transformer into the basement. According to Berdella, Pearson was by far the most cooperative of his 6 murder victims. On the 5th day of his captivity, having by this stage endured torture such as the repeated administration of electrical shocks with the transformer and the breaking of several hand bones with an iron rod to render him submissive, Berdella deduced Pearson had earned his trust as to his continued cooperation in his sexual and physical abuse. As a form of reward, Pearson was moved to the 2nd floor, with Berdella first informing Pearson that if he continued to cooperate, he would not continue to inflict as much pain upon him as he had done so while he was held captive in the basement. Throughout the latter part of his 6 weeks of captivity, Pearson trained himself to sleep without moving so that he didn't antagonize Berdella and thus invite further torture to return to the basement. After 6 weeks of captivity, Pearson deeply bit into Berdella's penis before screaming that he couldn't continue to tolerate his ongoing poor treatment. In response, Berdella killed Pearson by bludgeoning him into unconsciousness with a tree limb, then suffocating him with a bag and ligature before driving to the hospital to receive treatment for his wound. Pearson's body was later dismembered in the basement, and his head initially stored in a plastic bag inside Berdella's freezer before being buried in the backyard. At 1 a.m. on the 29th of March 1988, Berdella abducted his last victim, 22-year-old male prostitute named Christopher Bryson, whom he lured to his house upon the promise of payment for sex. At Berdella's home, Bryson was knocked unconscious with an iron bar, then bound to Berdella's bed, where he was subjected to similar methods of abuse and torture endured by previous victims, although in Bryson's case, Berdella repeatedly swabbed his eyes with ammonia before exclaiming to him, After several days, Berdella explained to Bryson that he'd begun to trust his captive, and that although he was willing to discuss some aspects of the abuse and torture he was receiving, there would be no negotiations regarding his sexual abuse. Berdella finished this discussion with a stern warning. By the third day of his capture, Bryson had earned sufficient trust from Berdella to persuade him to establish a daily regime of tying his hands in front of him after his sexual abuse rather than to the bed above his head, upon the excuse that his doing so was restricting the circulation to his arms. He'd also persuaded Berdella to leave a television on in the room with the remote control placed between his legs whenever Berdella was out of the room. Bryson later stated to investigators that he thought almost constantly about escaping. The following day, he managed to break free of his restraints by burning through them with a book of matches Berdella had inadvertently left in the room within his reach when he'd left the house to go to work. Wearing nothing but a dog collar, Bryson managed to escape from the house by jumping from a second-floor window, breaking a bone in his foot. He ran towards a meter reader who was walking down the other side of the street, shouting for him to call the police. The meter reader led Bryson to the house which he had been approaching. Occupants called the police, who arrived minutes later. Questioned at the scene by 4 officials, Bryson initially claimed that he had been hitchhiking when abducted by Berdella, who had kidnapped, raped and tortured him for 4 days before escaping by jumping from a window on the second floor of the property. Berdella had kept him bound on the bed on the second floor of the house throughout much of the time, repeatedly sodomizing him, drugging him and injecting his throat with drain cleaner to diminish his ability to speak loudly. As Bryson spoke, the officers also noted that in addition to the dog collar and broken foot, Bryson had red, swollen eyes and visible scars and welts across his entire body. 2 officers were told to maintain discreet surveillance of the property. Bryson was driven to the Menorah Medical Center for treatment, accompanied by a 3rd officer, while the 4th officer radioed the Kansas City Police Department to request a formal search warrant of the property. During later questioning by the KCPD, Bryson divulged that his captor had shown him Polaroid pictures of men who appeared to be deceased, and that he was told that he would never leave the property, and that if he became a nuisance or threat, he would either be subjected to greater levels of torture than what he'd already endured, or simply be killed. On the afternoon of Bryson's escape, Berdella was arrested on charges of pertaining to the sexual assault of Christopher Byron. He declined to allow officers inside his home, but the earlier requested warrant to search his property was drafted, and the officers gained access to the property the same day. Corroborating Bryson's claims of being restrained and tortured on the second-floor bedroom, investigators discovered the bedroom on the second floor had burnt ropes attached to the posts and foot of the bed. Also in the room was an electrical transformer plugged into the wall with wires leading to the bed. A metal tray containing syringes, small bottles apparently containing prescription drugs, swabs and eye drops were also close to the bed. He also found in the room were a long iron pipe, various lengths of rope and leather belts. Investigators also noted that the posts on the bed had been extensively worn, suggesting that restraints had earlier been tied to them, and that the individual or individuals had struggled to free themselves. Searching the house and the grounds of 4315 Charlotte Street, investigators uncovered a human skull inside a closet on the second floor of this property, and a partially decomposed human head in the backyard. The search also uncovered several human vertebrae, scarred by both hacksaw and knife marks stowed in a hallway, and several human teeth stowed in 2 envelopes. Both a hacksaw and a miter saw were discovered in the basement of the property, and a chainsaw was also found to be soiled with bloodstains, flesh and pubic hairs. Luminal tests revealed that the floor of Berdella's basement and 2 plastic trash barrels were extensively blood-stained. 334 Polaroid pictures and 34 snapshot prints of various men were also found in Berdella's house. These pictures showed Christopher Byron and several other men, both in life and death. Many of the images had been taken while the men were being tortured. The search also uncovered numerous restraints and sexual devices, pornographic literature, hypodermic needles, and a book on narcotics. Officers also discovered a stenographer's pad containing detailed torture logs that Berdella had maintained for each victim, lying on top of a chest of drawers. Several newspaper clippings from the Kansas City Star mentioned a missing young man named Jerry Howell, and a wallet and driver's license belonging to a missing person named James Ferris were discovered in a closet on the second floor of the property. Before the search of Berdella's property had concluded, the KCPD assembled a special task force of 11 detectives and 1 sergeant to focus exclusively on the Berdella case. This task force extensively researched Berdella's history, discovering that he was well known among the Kansas City's male hustlers, having earned a reputation for preying on transient young men. Several of these male prostitutes were also reluctant to accept him as a client, both because of his penchant for drugging, injecting and torturing his sexual partners and acquaintances, and also because he had long being considered a suspect in the disappearance of two men whose personal possessions had been found in the house, Jerry Howell and James Ferris. Missing person reports had been filed for both these men, and Berdella had been extensively questioned in relation to the disappearances. He denied having anything to do with the disappearances. Despite being considered a prime suspect in both cases and being placed under surveillance, police had been unable to find any solid evidence linking him to either man's disappearance. In both instances, after giving his initial statement to police, Berdella indignantly refused to talk further without having a lawyer present. His lawyer would later threaten to file harassment accusations against the police unless their questioning and surveillance of him ceased. James Ferris's wife identified him in several Polaroids found at Berdella's property, some taken after her husband's death. Paul Howell formerly identified a picture of a young man hanging upside down in Berdella's basement as his son. Several other Polaroid images depicted as yet unidentified young men, and several detectives were assigned to identify them to determine that if they were alive or dead, and if alive, the circumstances of the picture. Since several of these images depicted a section of the body of the photographer, on the 13th of April, Berdella was ordered to pose nude for a series of photographs in the same precise angles as the evidence photos for comparison with the original Polaroid images. As numerous male names had been found scrawled upon various stenographers' pads at Berdella's address, the detectives began attempting to trace each of them. One of those traced, a young man named Freddie Kellogg, was able to state to detectives that he and several other young men had intermittently lodged with Berdella since the early 1980s, and that Berdella had been in the habit of plying his lodgers with drugs, typically intravenously, before engaging in sex with them, regardless of if they consented or not. Kellogg stated that in order for him to be allowed to lodge with Berdella, he must agree to persuade young men whom Berdella found attractive to attend parties at Charlotte Street so that Berdella could drug them. Should Berdella ever discover that any of them was a police informant, he would use this knowledge to blackmail them. Despite this threat, Kellogg stated that numerous male prostitutes and addicts had been reluctant to engage in any form of contact with Berdella because of numerous of his links to the 1984 disappearance of Jerry Howell. In addition to these disclosures, Kellogg was able to name three of the men depicted in the Polaroids as Todd Stoops, Robert Sheldon, and Larry Wayne Pearson. The investigators would discover that Berdella had paid a $30 fee to secure a bond for Pearson in June 1987, the equivalent of about $83 in 2025, and that no further records existed to indicate that Pearson was still alive. Nonetheless, investigators did discover that in August 1987, Berdella had filed an assault report from a hospital room alleging that a man named Larry Pearson had deeply bitten into his penis during oral sex, causing a serious laceration. An interview with Robert Sheldon's employees at a Kansas City manufacturing plant confirmed that although the young man had been a reliable employee, he had suddenly ceased attending work in April 1985. Shortly after the search of 4315 Charlotte Street had concluded, Berdella was informed of the discoveries at his property. The same afternoon, he was ordered to pose for the series of nude photographs for comparison with the Polaroid images he had taken. Investigators attempted to conduct their first formal investigation with him, although Berdella simply invoked his right to silence in the setting. Investigators later sought to obtain handwriting samples from Berdella in an effort to prove that he'd written the notes found within the various stenographers' pads discovered at his house. He refused to cooperate and was sentenced to 6 months in jail for contempt of court. Initially, Berdella was formally charged with 1 count of felonious restraint, 1 count of assault, and 7 counts of forcible sodomy, as investigators continued their investigations into the discoveries at his property. He was assigned a temporary public defender as his legal representative and held in protective custody in the Jackson County Jail in lieu of a $500,000 bail, the equivalent of approximately $2 million as of 2025. In late April, the skull found inside Berdella's closet was identified via dental x-rays obtained via a subpoena from the University of Kansas Medical Center as that of Robert Sheldon. The same day, a dental identification was made on Sheldon's skull. 2 men separately phoned the Kansas City Police Department to state one of the 7 unidentified young men depicted in a photographic array released to the media on the 27th of April was a former high school acquaintance of theirs named Mark Wallace. When a detective contacted Wallace's sister, she stated that her brother had been missing since mid-1985. Shortly thereafter, investigators discovered that photograph D, released to the media in the same array, was one Larry Wayne Pearson. As Pearson had once been a ward of the court in Wichita, his dental records were available to be compared with the skull found in Berdella's backyard. Berdella would be formally charged with the murder and dismemberment of Larry Wayne Pearson in July after the head discovered in his backyard was formally identified as Pearson's on the 12th of May. Prosecutors had gathered sufficient circumstantial evidence to accompany the physical evidence retrieved. On the 22nd of July 1988, a grand jury formally indicted Berdella for the murder of Larry Wayne Pearson. The following month, he was arraigned and pleaded guilty in the Fourth Circuit of the Jackson County Court before Judge Alvin C. Randall to the first-degree murder of Larry Pearson. The plea was entered following a late morning recess in the arraignment hearing into this particular murder and came as a surprise to both the judge and prosecuting attorneys. The prosecution team assigned to the case accepted the plea, with Assistant Prosecutor Pat Hall later explaining this decision as being in the best interest of our client, the people of the state of Missouri. Following the submission and acceptance of this plea, the judge insisted that Berdella confess under oath as to Pearson's death. In response to being questioned by his attorneys, Berdella stated, when asked if he performed this act deliberately and with malice afterthought, he simply stated, yes. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Upon being sentenced, he was transferred to the Missouri State Penitentiary to commence his life sentence. He would later be temporarily placed in protective custody at the Potosi Correctional Center due to concerns for his safety. A second guilty plea submitted before the Jackson County Court on the 24th of August earned Berdella a further life term without parole for 1 charge of forcible sodomy against Christopher Bryson, 6 counts of sodomy, and 1 charge of assault. Being dropped as part of a plea bargain, he would also receive a further term of 7 years pertaining to 1 count of felonious restraint against Bryson on the state. Despite initially pleading not guilty to the remaining 5 murder charges on the 13th of September 1988, with the agreement of his 2 defense attorneys, Berdella ultimately conducted a plea bargain with the prosecutors in order to avoid the death penalty in these remaining charges. In this plea bargain, he agreed to confess in graphic detail as to whom he had killed, what indignities he had inflicted upon each victim, how he had killed each victim, and what he had done with their bodies. These confessions were given to prosecutors between the 13th and 15th of December 1988. In return for his cooperation, the prosecution agreed not to seek the death penalty at a formal hearing scheduled for 9 a.m. on the 19th of December. On the 19th of December 1988, he formally waived his rights to be tried for any of the outstanding murder charges, upon the understanding that he was to be convicted of 1 further count of first-degree murder, that of Robert Sheldon, and 4 counts of second-degree murder. He formally pleaded guilty to each of these charges before Judge Robert Mayers in the Jackson County Circuit Court. Members of the public were prohibited from attending this hearing, with only family members of the victims and news reporters permitted access to these proceedings. In response to the guilty pleas, Judge Mayers imposed 5 further concurrent life sentences, with an additional condition barring any future prospect of parole in the sole case of first-degree murder to which Berdella pleaded guilty. He provided testimony to prosecutors between the 13th and 15th of December after he changed his plea and sought approval of their agreement to not seek the death penalty against him if he fully confessed. In this testimony, he claimed the movie he had first seen in 1965, The Collector, had left a major impression on him. Following the senses of shock and disgust he claimed to have initially experienced after killing his first victim, the movie had resurfaced in his memory and subsequently became a motivating psychological force in the actions he exhibited against his victims in his subsequent murders. His victims, he later stated to investigators, had lost any degree of humanity in his eyes once he had chosen to render them captive. He confessed that many of the abbreviated entries within the torture logs were simply shorthand terms for methods of abuse he had inflicted, whereas others would describe either their reactions or these ongoing acts of abuse and torture, or his initial abbreviations upon viewing them when he entered the room where he'd kept them restrained. The entry reading CP, for example, referred to the chlorpromazine he had injected to assist in his restraining of the men, whereas entries reading DC referred to swabbing their eyes with drain cleaner, or the injection of the substance into their vocal cords. Entries reading EK or EKG referred to torture administered to his captives with electrical shocks, whereas several other entries contained the anatomical location where he administered the abuse or torture. For example, at one point in relation to James Ferris, he'd written an entry reading 2.5 KET NK plus shoulder to indicate that he ejected 2.2 cubic centimeters of ketamine into Ferris's neck and shoulder. Other entries such as gag loose, no resist in retie, or very delayed breathing, snoring were more self-explanatory. Investigators consulted a specialist in toxicology in their investigation into Berdella following his arrest, who stated that, judging by the notes he had written about Robert Sheldon, the accumulation of chlorpromazine injected into him had been toxic. Furthermore, Berdella confessed to having alternatively buried 2 victims' heads in his backyard, adding that he retrieved and cleaned the first skull, that of Robert Sheldon, at the time he buried Larry Pearson's head in the same hole. Sheldon's skull was that which he placed inside a closet on the second floor in his property in an area of the household Berdella referred to as my gallery area. He removed the teeth from the skull and kept them stowed inside envelopes. He further claimed to have intended to retrieve Pearson's skull once sufficient time had elapsed for it to skeletonize, although he was adamant that there had been no rational or sinister reason for him doing so. In addition, he vehemently denied media rumours that he'd been engaged in any form of Satanism or that he sold sections of the bodies in his flea market booth. He was able to name all of his victims to investigators. Although Mark Wallace had been seized by opportunity when Berdella had found him seeking shelter from a severe thunderstorm in his tool shed, his other 5 victims had been captured after he unsuccessfully tried to steer them away from their general lifestyles, and thus simply became frustrated at the failure of his efforts. Regarding each victim's captivity, he described in graphic detail the sexual, physical, and emotional abuse he had subjected to each individual, and which he had recorded within his torture log. He explained his successive actions to investigators on the 14th of December with a statement that he was Nonetheless, he did claim that he tried to prevent any of his victims from developing any form of malnutrition or infection by occasionally administering antibiotics or nutrients intravenously as his abuse and torture escalated. The methods of torture exhibited against his victims had included the administration of high-voltage electrical shocks, starvation, the application of alkali-based detergents into their throats, vocal cords, or eyes, and the bludgeoning of their hands with the intention of rendering these body parts unusable. One other method of torture was the insertion of needles beneath their fingernails. Furthermore, he confessed that the level of abuse he inflicted had increased with each successive victim, and that he viewed the Polaroid images that he had taken of his victims as being a trophy or record of the event. Although police extensively searched for the remains of his victims throughout their initial investigation into his crimes, the confession he provided to investigators that in the autumn of 1988 confirmed that he dismembered the bodies of all 6 of his victims, confirmed that the dismembered bodies of all 6 of his victims had been stowed in trash bags and taken to unknown landfill sites. Their bodies were never recovered. In the years following his 1988 convictions and incarceration, Berdella granted an interview to the Missouri-based television station KCPT and corresponded with numerous individuals. To all concerned, he attempted to restore his image as a sensitive citizen who had simply made mistakes in committing his crimes. He further claimed that he'd been demonised unfairly by the media before, during, and after his arraignments and plea bargains, and that police ineptitude had resulted in his being allowed to remain at liberty following his first murder. He also lodged several complaints with the prison officials regarding his prison conditions. He also wrote several letters to a local minister claiming that prison officials knew of his high blood pressure, yet were not providing him with prescribed heart medication. In 1992, Berdella contacted Reverend Roger Coleman, whom he had met when he was first incarcerated, relaying his distress that the staff at the Missouri State Penitentiary were withholding his heart medication. At 2 p.m. on the 8th of October 1998, he complained to prison staff of severe heart pains and was taken from his cell to the prison infirmary. Medical staff determined that his heart was unstable and called an ambulance. He was taken to a hospital in Columbia, Missouri, where he was pronounced dead from a heart attack at 3:55 p.m. He was 43 years old. Shortly after the judge at his trial, Alvin Randall was informed of his death. In response, Randall sarcastically remarked, "Couldn't have happened to a nicer guy." According to published reports, although Berdella had a depressive personality disorder, he was also a diagnosed sexual sadist who gained extreme sexual excitation from the humiliation, pain, and torture to which he subjected his victims. Moreover, despite his claims to journalists that he'd contacted in the years of his incarceration, he never expressed any degree of remorse for his actions and even referred to his victims as play toys in an interview he granted shortly before his death. In November 1988, auctions of his vast collection of artefacts and furniture confiscated from his home and business were held on 4 separate dates, with the intention that all proceeds raised at the auctions to be used to pay his mounting legal fees within then ongoing legal proceedings. The auction attracted considerable national interest, receiving telephone bids from across the US. Although many items sold for less than the expected price, by the end of the first day's auctioneering alone, more than $60,000 had been raised, equivalent to $160,000 in 2025. His house was purchased by a local businessman for an undisclosed sum in December 1988. The property was later demolished. Thank you for watching today's video. I hope you enjoyed. Are there any other true crime cases that you would like to see me cover on this channel? If so, let me know in the comments. What are your thoughts and opinions about this case? Also let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching, and I'll be back next Friday at 5 o'clock with another true crime case.